Again, welcome to everybody that has been joining. We're just holding for about a minute to allow the computer system to get everybody on, and they can start with us all from the very beginning. We'll get started in just a minute. Okay, well, welcome. I'm Sarah Evans, and I'm one of your presenters today for Demystifying SDI. We're very excited to have everybody here. This is a very interactive session where you'll be doing several different activities with us throughout the next 2 hours and 45 minutes. Like we said earlier in the morning session, if you were able to attend the morning welcome session, there will be a break about halfway through. We'll take 15 minutes, allow everybody to get up, stretch their legs, refill their drinks, use the restroom, whatever they need to do to make themselves comfortable. So we will have a break about halfway through. And then you will also have another break after this session before you join some of our last sessions around our resources. And we'll talk more about that at the very end of today's presentation. So as everybody's joining, we do have everybody's video off and audio off, as we have interpreters for some of our guests today, and it makes it easier for them when our ASL interpreters are spotlighted to be able to gain the information from the presentation. So we're excited that we're able to offer this service for everybody. I'm going to turn it over to Katie McClintock. She is our tech person for today, and she's going to kick us off with just a few housekeeping slides, and we'll get going from there.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. So if you go to the next slide, just a reminder, as standard, we want to let you know that this will be a recorded session so that we can share it later. So just keep that in mind. And then the next slide. Okay, so we're using Zoom. Hi, we're all here on Zoom. Just a few quick reminders. So we have 2 ways to connect today. We are using a Q&A box, so you can use this for questions that you have about the content. You could post them here. We also have the chat, so you can reach out to me for any technical issues through the chat. You can do it privately, or you can post your chat for the entire session if you have any questions. You can also use the chat for any interactive questions that we might pose to you. You can post your response in the chat. So feel free to use either one of those, but general questions can go in the QA, and participation and questions, tech questions, can go in the chat. Okay, so that was a quick overview. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Tessie Bailey, and she's going to get us started with a session on demystifying SDI.
Hi, everyone. I see there's a lot of folks from California. I'm curious about the smoke. I was just there yesterday and drove trying to chase the smoke or get away from the smoke. So I hope you all are being healthy. We are excited to be here today and share a little bit about what we've learned in terms of designing and implementing SDI. And most of this session will be, and Sarah, I just requested, there we go. There are 3 of us today. And so Sarah mentioned, she will be with Tamara doing some of the primary delivery of the content. And then myself, I'm going to stay on at the very beginning, and I'm going to showcase one of our new upcoming videos that you'll be able to use in your own professional learning to really work with new teachers and help some of your more senior teachers as well understand how everything fits together to promote an IEP that's likely to promote progress. And Sarah, it's real tiny, so it might be better if you push it. So. Katie, as you saw, is our technical support today. So if you have any questions about technology, accessing the materials, just let her know. You will also see that there's a lot of opportunity for question and answer throughout. There are a lot of questions around it, and Sarah and Tamara will engage you all in some conversations to get those questions answered in a live format. But if we don't get to your question, we will try to address them towards the end. And if your question gets lost, because it's kind of a rolling chat, just make sure you put it back in so we don't forget about it. All right, I'm going to pass this to Sarah, who's going to get us controlled with our Menti.
Okay. Sorry, I am spotlighting people and people are stealing my screen, so it messed my order up. I apologize for that glitch, and we'll get even better as we go. So we just want to know who's in the room today. And so what we're going to ask you to do in the chat, Katie's going to share the link to our Mentimeter, or you can take your phone or another device and scan the QR code and join the session with that. And I am making sure I have my screen shared. There we go. And we just want you to scan this QR code. We're going to ask you a few questions. I will be showing them on the screen, but I'll give you a second. You can also click on the link if you want to use your computer in front of you to join the Menti. We will use this Mentimeter throughout the entire 2 hours and 45 minutes. So we ask that you don't shut this down, but that you pause in between each section as we ask questions. So I'll let everybody be able to join, and we will move forward to the next slide. So our first question today is going to be, what is your role? So we can see that we have quite a few special education teachers, district and school administrators, a couple of general education teachers. Yay, shout out to our gen ed teachers for joining and wanting to learn how to help students with disabilities in their environment. We have some higher ed staff and some interventionists. Wow, great to see everybody, and we're excited to have you here. So we're going to move to the next question. And I'm going to start this one. What is the grade span in which you work with? Okay, we see it coming in. And other is likely they're working with people that fall in maybe the school district, teachers, maybe not students directly. I see we have a couple pre-service, we have a couple elementary, lots of people with other. In the chat, if you want to share with us what your other is and how you interact with in your role, we would love to see that. So feel free to add that information into the chat as we go here in the next few minutes. Our next question is, how many years have you been teaching or in education? Okay, so we have a lot of people with quite a bit of experience in the room today, which is great. This is our 201 session. So it is meant to dig a little deeper into understanding SDI and the myths that sometimes are around that, and how it embeds into the work that we're doing within high quality education for our students with disabilities. For those of you that are in the 0 to 5, welcome. This is still going to be a great session where you're going to really dig deep and understand several parts of the IDEA and how they fit into the big picture of what we're doing. So welcome everybody. We're excited to have a great group here. I'm going to toss it back over to Dr. Bailey, and she's going to kick off the session with some introduction information.
I have to say, I am quite impressed by just the number of years that folks have been in education. So kudos to all of you. I saw some 50 years, some 40-year. I hope to be there pretty soon. Today's session is, as Sarah mentioned, is highly interactive. So there are a number of resources that we will be using. I did put in the chat box where you can access those. Amy also shared where you can access all the resources, including the PowerPoint we're sharing today, at any time. So we'll put that back in the chat if you need it. We're going to talk about the 4 parts of the statement of services and aids, because one of the things that we've learned is that sometimes people need non-examples of what is specially designed instruction to really understand what specially designed instruction is. It's commonly confused with supplementary aids and services, and this can be detrimental to the resources and supports and aids that we provide to students. We're going to talk about how specially designed instruction fits within the statement of services and aids, how it interacts with the other services that we provide to students, as well as its interaction with the PLAF statement, as well as the annual goals that we've set for the student. So by the end of this session, you should really be able to explain what specially designed instruction is and what it is not. We also know that you're only here with us for a short period of time. So we're going to provide you with a number of resources that you can continue to use outside of today's session, both from learning modules. We have tip sheets, videos. I'm going to share with you one of our new videos that's coming out to really help bring your staff sort of to this common understanding of what is specially designed instruction, whose roles, who is responsible for its design and its delivery, and how do we maximize our staff to be able to implement that. So a couple of things about specially designed instruction and the IEP in general. So in our opening session, we did talk about how important it is to ensure that kids have access to high quality instructional programming. And towards the end, I sort of clarified that there are 2 things we need to talk about. One is the development of the programming, right? So it's the same as the development of your IEP, identifying the instructional adaptations, where will these services be delivered? We need to come to some consensus in our IEP about what those services look like. The other thing that we need to attend to is the implementation of those, because sometimes our IEPs and our plans, lesson plans that we outline are really well designed. But if we don't have the capacity, the resources, the staff to implement them, then we don't really get to those outcomes. So when we think about high quality educational programming, we're going to be talking about the design of specially designed instruction, as well as the implementation, which is required for students to access FAPE. There are 3 sort of buckets of work that we think about in terms of ensuring students have access to FAPE. And this has to do with the IEP, not just specially designed instruction. But there's the procedural aspect, and that procedural aspect really looks at the extent to which we follow the requirements of the law. There are 7 requirements of every IEP, regardless of what state you're in, and we need to make sure that those components of the IEP are addressed. The other major procedural concern that we have is the engagement of families, meaningful engagement of families in the development of the IEP and the SDI that's embedded within it. We're going to talk about the substantive requirement a lot today, because it's really the so what. It means that we not only met the procedural requirements, but that we designed this IEP, including the specially designed instruction, that's going to allow this student to make appropriate progress in light of the child's circumstances. And this has to do with the specially designed instruction aligns to the student's disability-related needs. It aligns to the IEP goals that have been set for the student, and that those 3 things have this level of internal consistency. In addition, we need to make sure that the implementation of that SDI occurs. Because if we design it well, we have great goals and have identified the needs, but we don't implement it, we're still not ensuring the student has access to a free, appropriate public education. Now, one of the things that we've been working on, and I'm going to share a video, although I cannot see my bar anymore, so I'm going to give up my powers. I'm going to share a video that allows you to sort of see how all of this fits together. So I want to thank Katie, who's on today in developing this, but it's a short little video that'll help us sort of see how these things work together to ensure students have access to FAPE. And if you guys can ensure I have audio, that would be great.
School and post-school success for students with disabilities depends on the development and implementation of a high-quality individualized education program, or an IEP. The IEP's development and implementation are comparable to the design and use of a bicycle. Bicycles are made up of individual parts, but it is only useful as a bike when all the parts seamlessly fit together. Similarly, an IEP is composed of required parts that, when aligned to each other, create an individualized program or vehicle that allows students with disabilities to make progress. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, outlines 7 required components or parts of a procedurally compliant IEP. Similar to a bike, which requires a frame, wheels, handlebars, seat, pedals, brakes, and chain, an IEP must include a present level of academic achievement and functional performance, PLAF, statement, measurable annual goals, a monitoring plan, statement of special education and services and aids, an explanation of the student's participation outside regular education and in state and district-wide assessments, and the date, frequency, duration, and location of services. Unfortunately, many educators and service providers focus on the development of individual components or parts of the IEP found in their IEP form or template. This can lead to what many believe is a compliant IEP that cannot be feasibly implemented or is not likely to promote progress. Focusing on the IEP components in isolation can devalue the IEP as a valuable tool and place compliance as the end result. It would be like buying expensive bike parts that do not fit together. What makes the bicycle functional is when all its parts fit together or align so that it can be ridden. It's the collection of the aligned parts that provides us with a well-designed bicycle. Ensuring all the parts of a bike fit together is very similar to ensuring the required parts of an IEP fit together. In well-developed IEPs, there is a direct relationship between the PLAF statement and the other components of the IEP. Ensuring the parts of the IEP fit together to demonstrate internal consistency allows IEP teams to address both the procedural and substantive requirements of providing students with disabilities a free, appropriate public education. Well-designed IEPs are also easier to implement and more likely to lead to improved academic and functional outcomes. The PLAF statement is the foundation of the IEP that documents the student's needs and baseline for measurable annual goals that are necessary to support the student in accessing and progressing in the general curriculum. A well-designed PLAF statement also justifies the proposed services and aids, including specially designed instruction and classroom accommodations and supports that are reasonably calculated to help the student progress on annual IEP goals and on state and district-wide assessments. Although bikes have similar components, not all bicycles are the same. Some are designed for the Tour de France, while others for going on a picnic or to the beach. There is no wrong bicycle, assuming the parts work together to meet the unique needs of that user. IEPs are very similar. They all have the same required components, but are designed to meet the unique needs of the student. How do we know if the IEP meets the student's needs? For each annual goal, the IEP team develops a description of how the student's progress towards the goal will be measured, which is shared with parents and families. When implemented with fidelity, the monitoring plan provides data that the IEP team can use to determine whether the IEP is reasonably calculated to promote appropriate progress for the student. In some cases, the student's circumstances and needs change, and the IEP team, which includes the family and student when appropriate, may need to make changes to the proposed aids and services. Remember, the IEP is not the outcome. It is the vehicle through which we can support students with disabilities in achieving school and post-school goals. Just like a well-maintained bicycle helps us navigate various terrains, an IEP that is implemented with fidelity and uses ongoing data to monitor its impact can help a student overcome obstacles and make meaningful progress. A well-developed and implemented IEP can ensure students with disabilities are able to access and benefit from school and post-school opportunities alongside their peers.
So hopefully this video is one of our, it's brand new, so we still are working on the caption for that, but we wanted to make sure that you all were able to see it, because this idea of being able to design an IEP that includes specially designed instruction is essential for us to be able to implement the proposed aids and services. We can't just implement SDI and assume that benefit will happen. There are other parts of that IEP that work together that really allow the SDI to maintain its full effect while students can simultaneously access from the curriculum. Yeah, thank you, Bobby. That analogy actually came from our project officer very early on in our work. And I think it's really helped us sort of think about sort of these procedural part pieces that are important, but also the development of the vehicle, right? The IEP that drives the work that we do, but is not the outcome of the work that we do. So this, what we're going to talk a lot about today is how the PLAF statement and its present levels of academic achievement and functional performance really drive the decision-making around the services and aids. It's the student's identified need that was part of the evaluation plan is what should be addressed in the specially designed instruction in your statement of services and aids. Right? And it's also what we would expect to see as an annual goal. And because kids have a wide variety of needs, the IEP primarily focuses on the disability-related needs that were identified in the evaluation programming. The annual goal should then be addressed by the specially designed instruction. It's not the supplementary aids and services in general education. Those are things like your accommodations that ensure the student can access. But the specially designed instruction are the things that we teach students so that they can progress on those annual goals. And the effectiveness of that SDI is ultimately based on the extent to which the student progresses on those IEP goals. So it fits together like this really seamless puzzle. And developing a internally consistent IEP can make our jobs way easier and much more effective. Part of this comes from, early work with the Raleigh decision in the 1980s, but also our sort of clarification of this substantive standard in the Andrew F. decision that Amy mentioned. And what we're looking to do is develop an IEP that's reasonably calculated. And the specially designed instruction is a part of that. What's unique about it is that we're taking into account the child's circumstances, their individual needs. And that's where we end up with this distinction between general instruction and specially designed instruction. I shared some of these at the very beginning, but I will say that as we move forward today, holding high expectations are essential for students. We need to believe that they can do that. Maybe we don't really know how, But that's the neat thing about specially designed instruction is we work as a team to try these iterative adaptations to our instruction to find what works for this child. That's what the IEP allows us with our monitoring plan to find out, well, did that adaptation work? And if not, how do we change it? We want to make sure that we know the students that we're working with and be able to clearly articulate what the student needs to do that the disability is impacting. Because once we know what they need to do and understand how the disability impacts it, then we'll know what specially designed instruction needs to focus on. So there are 4 parts of the statement of services and aids, and that's what we're going to dive into today, because understanding the role of specially designed instruction and how all of the other aids and services support it or complement it really allows us to maximize the benefit of the IEP. And something just to keep in mind when we think about the IEP, which is in the other session we talked quite a bit about, is we're going to focus on 2 things, the development. And the development within the IEP is the documentation of the adaptations. It's not necessarily how the district is going to implement the IEP. That's deference to the district based on the case law. But it outlines what are the adaptations that this student needs in content, methodology, and delivery, so that they can gain the knowledge, skills, and strategies necessary to access and progress in the general curriculum. The implementation really is how the team takes those adaptations documented in the IEP and implements them within our system. So are you leveraging your MTSS? How do your leaders set up the school schedule? How you allocate staffing? That's deference to the district and the school to be able to do that. Does not necessarily need to be documented in your IEP unless your state rules allow that. So before we move forward, I want to see if there are any comments or questions, and I'll pass it over to Sarah to get us into the content. I see a lot of folks like the analogy of the bike, and as soon as that video is released, follow us in the newsletter, and you'll be able to access that. So I do want to go back to the previous slide, and Sarah, if you can go back. I don't have access anymore because I can't see the chat at the same time. The IEP is around what does this student need in order to progress on their IEP goals and benefit from the general curriculum. And so if you think about the IEP, it's what are the services that the student needs? There's this other piece about how the district will implement those services, which staff people you're going to use, how you're going to allocate it, where it's going to fit in the schedule. The only things that you would document within the IEP are the things that this student needs. So if they don't need a particular schedule or a particular person, or there's flexibility in the curriculum, we wouldn't document those in the IEP per se. Hopefully that makes sense. So when you're thinking about MTSS and SDI, are there good resources? We have... Yes, when thinking about MTSS, are there any good resources that really helps educators understand? Yes. So Sarah and one of our other colleagues, and we'll put the link in the chat box, is around using specially designed database individualization at tiers 2 and tier 3, and how that aligns with specially designed instruction implementation. It actually creates a nice seamless transition. So what if a school structure does not allow for inclusion? So this is a question in the chat box. If a student requires a certain service, the school must make an effort to implement those services. Inclusion is the way that you design your system. So if your system doesn't allow for students to access the general curriculum or be included, then you need to rethink the way that you're designing your system. We often use this terminology of I'm an inclusive school or I'm not an inclusive school. kind of going back to what Glenna mentioned, every school should ensure that students with disabilities can access and benefit from the curriculum. How that looks in your school is different. There's no legal definition of inclusion, but there are best practices that we know from the research on how we implement those. What do you say to schools and districts that say MTSS is not for students with disabilities? I would say they should contact us because if you think about students with disabilities, they are general education students. And Glenna made clear that special education is supplemental. The neat thing about using or having MTSS infrastructure within your school is that we can also leverage it for the delivery of specially designed instruction. It's not a parallel system. It's that we're creating, and Susan mentioned it, a system that's accessible to all students. And so we want to think about that. Yeah, so Jen is mentioning, and that's what I was saying, is if we're not designed for inclusion, then we're designed for discrimination or segregation. That's a great reference. Jennifer mentioned, you say adaptations. That is something that Sarah's going to dive into. And so we think about how we document specially designed instruction in IEP is we document the instructional adaptations that students need to progress on their IEP goals and access the general curriculum. And those adaptations are outlined in the regulations in terms of content, actually in the statute, content, methodology, and delivery. So we'll talk a lot more about those in today's session. Great, so I think that I got together, but Karen, to your point, that link we just put in the chat box around SDI, DBI for SDI, there are some very clear markers, and we'll talk a little bit about some of those today, that would trigger a team to say, this kid needs specially designed instruction, which most kids in tier 2 or tier 3 might need, but this kid needs it because we suspect a disability. That's what triggers that referral. There are a lot of kids who need specially designed instruction, but some of them don't need it because of a disability. Then they would not qualify for services under IDEA. And then Sherry mentioned lack of inclusion could be because of a specialized school setting. So there may not be general education population in the audience. And I know we have some specialized institutionalized schools. I know Sarah and I work with some of those in Wyoming, just where I am today. And it's important for us to really ensure that we provide those opportunities to the extent practicable. And that is outlined in the statute. All right, so we are, go ahead, Sarah.
I was just saying, I want to encourage you guys to keep asking questions as we go through, unless there's a slide like the current one. We would love for you to put your questions in the Q&A because we're going to ask you to do a lot of participation in the chat. So to keep it kind of separate, if we ask you on a slide like we have displayed now, you are welcome to put it in the chat just like you did. That works perfect. But if we're talking and you're like, can you clarify this, or can you share a resource for this, please put that in the Q&A. And then that way, when we are in the chat, it will really be about something that we're interacting with, because we have at least 5 interactive activities for you to participate with in this session today. And that just helps clarify for everybody. And we can also save those chats for you, or those Q&As for you in the future as well. So,
and for those of you who cannot see your Q&A, it may be hidden under more. So make sure that you click on the 3 ellipses with more. And if you open that, that's where you'll see the Q&A to input those.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Bailey. And we're excited. It was a great overview to think about the statements of services and aids. And we really want to take a moment and break it down. We're here to demystify SDI and talk about what SDI is, what it is not. But what we have found over the 5 years of Progress Center is that people don't always have the most clear picture of the statement of services and aids and how SDI fits in that big picture. So our goal, as Tessie shared in our objectives, is for you to really make sure you understand how these parts work together and where SDI fits and where we need to focus our development and implementation on SDI. So now we're going to dive a little bit deeper and start really getting into the real meat of what we're talking about today. And so we always want to remind ourselves about this. Many of you as experienced educators know that we have the 2 criteria for eligibility. But as Tessie was just answering questions, she spoke to this. And she was talking about the fact that, and some of you are asking questions about MTSS and saying, you know, many schools tier 3 is special education. What the difference between students with intensive needs in tier 3 and the students that have intensive needs that are eligible under the 13 categories, which is our first prong you see on the screen, is that they need special education and related services based on a need from a disability. And that is different than a student that needs intensive level supports, who may need specially designed instruction and some related services to make progress, but their needs are not based specifically from a disability and how that disability is impacting their ability to learn. So they can look very similar in their profiles, but one is based off that disability need and the other is just based off of instructional support that needs to take place. And so many times this is a misunderstanding in a school system, and several of your questions around MTSS and how that works is where people don't have clarity around the idea of the difference between those profiles in their learners. So as Tessie was sharing earlier, she shared all of our elements under IDEA that are critical and how they fit together in a wonderful puzzle that brings this big picture of an IEP, both in its document and implementation. Today, we're really going to focus on the one box, the green box on the screen, the Statement of Services and Aids. Now, that box is critical, but it is also, as you can see the red arrows, it is also reliant on a present level of performance. It's also reliant on annual goals and measuring those annual goals. We also have to think about the statewide indicators and assessments that students take. But today, our deep dive is going to be focused on that. But you will hear us as we dive deep into the Statement of Services and Aids. We'll reference back to the present level of performance or the annual goals and how critical those are in the development of the Statement of Services and Aids. So Katie is going to drop a link into the chat. This is also available, she did it at the beginning of the chat, where all of the resources for today are on our website and posted. This is the overview tip sheet. So she's going to post that link. I ask that you click on that link and you open up the Statement of Services and Aids tip sheet for you to reference in this next activity. So this is going to be the first of our activities. All of them are going to be set up very similar, but we're going to give you time to think through this a little bit on your own. A lot of you have experience. If you're new, you might have some aha moments. You might say, I didn't realize IDEA said that. I didn't realize it was worded that way. So what I want you to do is just open up that link that Katie shared. Look at the overview of the Statement of Services and Aids. I'm going to pause for 3 minutes, and I'm going to allow you to read through this. While you're reading through it, I want you to jot down key features that you noticed, any ahas that you had, anything that made you say, wow, I didn't realize that it was worded that way. Anything that struck you as important, I want you to jot those down. And when we get back, I'm going to ask you to put into the chat, answer some questions in the chat for us today. So I'm going to pause, give you 3 minutes to go ahead and highlight or jot down key features. You may begin. Wow, great comments in the chat. I hope you all are taking a moment to read some of the ahas, the requirements that people identify that maybe they didn't know ahead of time. Parent training and counseling is one that comes up a lot. I'm going to hold off on that one because we are going to go through the related service tip sheet here in a few minutes and talk a little bit more in depth about that. But I do want to back up to a few comments that were made towards the beginning and point out some really important things. So we have a facilitator guide on how to use our tip sheets. So several people commented how they really like the tip sheets. They're basic, they're easy to read and digest. And we do have a facilitator guide that helps walk through these types of activities that we do within our presentation. So if you're interested in that, I'll have Katie add that link to the chat as well. And that goes for any of our tip sheets. This is just one of our many tip sheets that we have available. But I did also want to say that many of you talked about things like the peer-reviewed research and to be educated with kids with their peers that are not disabled. You pointed out that there were supports for school personnel and it wasn't special education personnel. And that was an aha for you. You put it, notice that there's a huge emphasis on the present levels. I think that's critical. As we talked about just a second ago, we were going to reference back, even though we're focused on one portion of the IEP elements, we are talking about this in a big picture. The present level has to describe what aids and services the student needs. That's aids and services within a special education service, a related service, an accommodation, and or supports for school personnel. All of those should be identified within the present level. And so that was a great aha that several of you added to the chat. So I had a question that came in: as a special educator in a severely profound classroom, how do I train a one-on-one TA that comes in with no experience when also having no time to speak to them? That is a barrier. And those are barriers that we experience in the special education world all the time. Sometimes what we would recommend is that the Progress Center has online modules and resources that you could utilize and ask that one-on-one to build their knowledge and understanding of what they're doing with the student, and then maybe having you have the opportunity to individualize it for the individual student that they're working with. But sometimes you have to build their basic knowledge of the idea of what they're there to support first, and then you can get into that individualized support. So as we keep moving down, can we elaborate on extracurricular activities, aspects of service? Yes, we get this question a lot when it comes to people thinking about services and aids. Services and aids are required to be available to students throughout their entire school day. Extracurricular activities are available to all students, and that means our students with disabilities as well. So when the IEP teams are planning the services and aids a student needs, they must consider what extracurricular activities is that student wanting to participate in, and are there any aids or services that student needs to have available to them to participate. Very simple one may be that if the student needs assessments or tests read aloud to them as part of an accommodation, and they are required as part of a tryout for an activity to have some basic knowledge and are assessed on that basic knowledge, they may need that reading service provided to them during that assessment period of the tryouts or the activity. You might have a student who receives sign language interpreting as an aid or service, and they want to participate in an activity. That sign language interpreting would need to be available for that student, and the team needs to think about how other services and aids may need to support that. So that is an aha that we get a lot when we go through this activity. You can see the parent training one comes up a lot, parent training and counseling, and thinking about that. Like I said, we're going to hold off on that one, and we're going to think through how that affects it when we get to the related service part. I'm just reading quickly through any others. Yes, aha that somebody put in was avoid identifying specific programs, and instead of thinking about the features that a program offers, and that's why you're selecting that program for the student, you're really needing to identify the features that that individual student needs and why that program helps identify meet the needs that the team has identified for that student, instead of saying this is a specific program that they need. Yes, I saw several things about the importance of collaboration, and this tip sheet itself, because it's looking at all 4 of the services, really highlights the need for collaboration between general education, special education, related service providers. Your administrators are going to need to be involved in the conversations about how to develop these aids and services for students, and how important that really is. And so many of you are asking for the facilitator guide, so they are coming. We are getting that. We'll get it set into the chat. It may already be there. I'm just scrolling down. So look down at the bottom. Katie will add the facilitator guide for the tip sheets to the chat here in just a second if she hasn't already. And then let me just do a couple more. I will say that the supports for school personnel has come up multiple times. I see Tessie's responding to several of those for me. And yes, it is critical that we think about and we will go over this as well as part of our tip sheet review, is that the supports for school personnel go above and beyond just special education staff, but any staff that needs to be able to help the implementation of the services and aids for an individual student. So we'll get to that in just a second. And the requirements for peer-reviewed research, to the extent practicable, who decides that? So when we talk about the idea of peer-reviewed research, is that we know that there are these students have individualized needs based on how a disability impacts them. And so what we have to think about is that we have to go with what we know is best for the student with the information that we have. We want to use peer-reviewed research first, but not everything we have is peer-reviewed. And so sometimes we have to look at what has the best effect with students with similar profiles and how that may work or not work with a student. I think the critical feature of the peer-reviewed research is it's where we start, and then we may have to make some adjustments based on the individualized need of the student. So there are programs and stuff that are peer-reviewed. It is a higher level than evidence-based practices, but it is what we are shooting for to the most to the best of our ability, is to find those high quality resources that are proven to have positive outcomes for students with disabilities with similar needs of the student that you're focusing on. And there's a question about, is there funding available to train the staff? That is the responsibility of the district, and each state handles their professional development funding a little bit different, but that is a great question to be asking administrators, especially at the district level, of how are PD funds available to you. And ultimately, as we know, if we have to embed some training into an IEP and it is in there, the district will need to think through how to implement that training need. And so definitely it's a conversation that should be having, you should be having prior to the team sitting down and having that conversation about these are things that need to be there and need to be supported, and problem solving those types of questions prior to sitting down as an IEP team and making the final decision what types of trainings and services there are. Okay, so I'm going to go to the next slide, and this is just some key features I want to make sure I pointed out. I know we answered a lot through your questions and your ongoing engagement, and I thank you for that. But one that we really like to point out is each one of our 4 services is connected by a singular word. That word is "and." So the statement of special ed and related services and supplementary aids and services and program supports or for school personnel. We want to make sure that we point out that when the law was written under IDA, the word "and" was put in there in a very strategic reason, for a very strategic reason. The reason is that we must, as an IEP team, consider all 4 areas of the services and aids. Not every student is going to need all 4 areas of service, but every IEP team must consider, is there a need in all 4 areas? It's okay if an IEP team says, no, at this point, we don't have any program modifications and there's no supports for school personnel to implement this program that are needed. It's okay to say the student is not in need of a related service at this time. The team they need to identify that as well. And they may need to recognize that they've addressed that in some sort of conversation with the families as a part of that requirement of family participation. But the word "and" connects all of them for that reason. And many people think it's or, it's special ed or related services or this, but it's really and we need to consider all 4. So these are some of the features that you guys pointed out that we should be looking at. This should advance appropriately towards their annual goals. It involves to be involved in and making progress in the general education curriculum. These services, like Tessie was saying earlier this morning when she was talking about promoting progress overall, we can be very focused on the progress of the IEP goal. But the reality is we need to get to the big picture, and that is post-secondary success. That is being able to have a career, a job, a successful life, whatever that may look like for that student and their desires. But ultimately, when we build these services and aids are allowing the student to make progress in the general education curriculum. So if we're writing and developing an IEP and we have a statement of services and aids, and we have that well developed for that student and they're not making progress in the general education curriculum, then likely we need to come back together and rethink about our statement of services and aids. A lot of times that goes back to high expectations. Are we holding that? Do we think the student can even make progress in the general education curriculum? And did we lower the bar inadvertently just by thinking they can't? Have we considered how they participate in extracurricular activities or non-academic activities? Can they be educated and participate with students that are not disabled and have equal access and a sense of belonging that they can be a part of that group successfully? That is all part of what they're saying here in the statement of services and aids. Those are our obligations. And I do recognize, I see that we're having some glitching with our ASL interpreter. We are working on that. I'm really sorry. My tech person, Katie, is working to see if we can get that rectified, and for those of you that need it. So we're on it. I see it coming up several times. So I just wanted to pause for a second and acknowledge that we're working on it for you guys. Thank you for your patience. We'll get right to that. So I want to take a second and look at a statement of services and aid that is a big picture for a student. One statement for one student is going to look different for another student. This is an example 6th grade student with a learning disability that impacts their ability to decode and fluently read connected text. So this team, this IEP team, came together and they decided that the SDI for this student would be 30 minutes of direct instruction in phonics and fluency taught by a special education teacher. Related services is speech services in to address the dysfluency and stuttering impact on the fluent reading of connected text. Supplemental aids and services is in the general education setting. They have access to audiobooks and peer readers. And then their modification, the program modification and support for school personnel is a special education teacher needs to participate in Orton-Gillingham training because the team has identified, you get to notice that under SDI, they did not say they were going to get Orton-Gillingham. What they said is that they need instruction in phonics and reading fluency, and Orton-Gillingham has the qualities that the student needs, so the teacher needs that extra training in that if they have not already had that training. So I think that's critical to look at it as one picture. what we hear most often from our participants in these activities, whether it be virtual or in person or at conferences, is that my IEP does not look like this, Sarah. I don't just get to say SDI and related services. It's often that the way that your state or local IEP document makes you break it apart becomes hard for you to think about this as one statement. Maybe you have special ed services in one area, and then you have related services in a completely different area, and you have program modifications somewhere else in the IEP. And so it's really hard to see the big picture that this is one statement about a student's need. And I think when we are training staff, and many of you said that you're responsible for training staff within your district, some of you are the staff, is that we can't let the document keep us from thinking about what is the overall need. We would recommend at Progress Center that you think through this and use a simple table, write it out, and then think about how it goes into your document. And if it's broke apart in your document, that's okay, because you can see the big picture of the one statement of services and aids and how they connect together. This becomes a barrier, and we have another resource that's called Get to Know Your IEP, that is a facilitator guide to breaking down your local document. It's not to say the document is strong or it's weak. It is really just for someone to truly understand, how is my document laid out, and how is that going to help me articulate the one statement of services and aids? How is it going to help me articulate the present level of performance, which should tell me what is in that one statement of services and aids? That is critical for this. So I'm going to toss it over to Tamara, who's going to jump us into the SDI portion, which is a little bit of a longer portion for us. Obviously, that's why you're here. We're talking about demystifying SDI. I'll be responding to a couple of the additional questions that came into the chat while I was talking. Tamara?
Thanks, Sarah. So similar to how Sarah kicked us off for the first tip sheet for the statement of services and aids, we're going to do the same similar activity for the next IEP tip sheet for special education, or SDI. So we are going to add a link to the chat to this tip sheet. And again, we're going to give you 3 minutes to jot down the key features or some aha moments, things that you didn't realize that were written about special education or SDI in IDEA. So we'll give you 3 minutes and then we'll bring you back. All right, so I'm going to bring you back. And in the chat, if you haven't already started to share your ideas, we're going to consider these questions. What are the requirements for SDI that you identified as you read through the tip sheet? Who is responsible for implementing SDI? And I know I've seen in the chat already considerations based on your local context of guidance on who can provide SDI, and then what other questions you have. So I'm just going to give you another few minutes to start adding those thoughts in the chat, but we'll also start talking about the conversations that we're seeing. Okay. So we're seeing a consensus about SDI being delivered in any location. I think earlier today, many of you saying that, special education is not a place. And that's something that we emphasize, is that it's a service and not a place or a location. Who is responsible for implementing SDI? Typically, special education teachers. So many of us with experience as special education teachers, we know that a lot of the time implementation of that student's SDI or their special education falls on us or that student's related service provider, depending on the situation. However, what you probably read is that it doesn't have to be the student's special education teacher. And we'll talk a little more about that too. But I'm seeing in the chat is that, yeah, you are seeing in your context is that, or your context, your state, or your district is that the requirement is the SDI be implemented. I think I've seen like the intervention specialist, or again, that related service provider. See something else here. I feel like accommodations and modifications are often confused with SEI. And again, that's why we're here. We'll talk about a lot of these misconceptions that we often, I guess, over time start to like muddy the waters a little in terms of what we understand and know about a student's special education or SDI. So I think just to kind of, I don't know if this makes you feel better, but just to share is that, even with our experiences, that sometimes we do have to unlearn things and relearn things in order to move forward and make progress. So those are things to consider as we're here, thinking about it as a safe space. We are trying to demystify and make sure that collectively we have an understanding of a lot of these misconceptions that maybe we have learned over time. Again, unlearn, relearn, and then move forward. Yes, I'm seeing general ed teachers can provide the SDI. The breakdown of the SEI elements are super helpful in guiding the team in considerations. I'm seeing a quote, ensuring that the team members understand the difference between SEI, accommodations, modifications, intervention programs, etc. Yes, and always, always, always is if we had time. That's always the biggest battle, right? Is how do we do this? How do we move forward? So, us sharing our resources, the facilitation guide. Once you leave here, how can you take it back to your local context and share what you've learned here today? And again, the process of unlearning and relearning to move forward. Engaging the student's family, special education, general education teachers. So again, going back to this is a team process, is not relying on just one person to implement the student's SDI. The critical importance of the data collection, and we'll touch on that a little bit today. I see a question here. Is there a way to include with which past adaptations were successful and unsuccessful in the IEP? We'll touch on that a little bit too in our presentation today when we talk about database individualization or DBI. So we will touch on that a little bit today as well, and how you would incorporate that moving forward. Other questions? I think that's like the consensus of what I see here in the chat. But again, feel free to continue to add your thoughts in the chat. But we'll get started and move forward in our presentation. But again, I think the big thing that I'm seeing here is that, again, SDI is a service and not a place, and that's really resonating with you all. So as you're reviewing, so a lot of the things that we saw here, again, is that SDI is a service. I saw some keywords, talking about adaptations. When you're making adaptations to that student's SCI, what does that look like? How do we document it? So again, just to review what IDEA says about special education, is that it's meant to meet the unique needs of that child. And it's developed with these three elements in mind: the content, the methodology, and the delivery of the instruction. And we'll talk about that more in depth in the next slides. But also what you see here, again, addressing the unique needs of the child and ensuring their access to the general ed curriculum so that they can meet those grade level standards or those general education standards. And I think maybe I saw a question related to I can't remember exactly. There's been so much engagement, which again, we appreciate from you all, the questions that we see. But I think there was maybe a question about the extent to which their SDI can be implemented in the general ed curriculum. And again, these are always team decisions. I can't sit here and say what that will look like for every child, what that student's SDI will be, because I would have to know the data. I would have to know the child. So I think keeping those things in mind of knowing your student, using your data to make those decisions on what that student's SDI will look like to, again, meet their unique needs is what's going to be most critical. Sarah, the next slide. So going back to those elements of a student's SDI, so the content, the methodology, and the delivery of instruction. So SDI, again, it's individualized. It's based on the need of the student. We're using their data to determine what needs to happen in order to meet their needs. So in terms of the content, what does that mean? That's what we're teaching the student. What is the content? Like, what are we focused on? The methodology, that's the how. How are we delivering the instruction? I know there was conversations about curricula. You know, what does that look like? Of course, shying away from specifically saying we're going to use Orton Gillingham or Wilson Reading Language System and then that being that child's SDI. And of course, you know, if you write that in the student's IEP, that is what you have to use in order to deliver their special education. However, the guidance is, instead of specifically saying whatever that curriculum is that you might be using, because again, that goes more into the implementation of that student's SDI, you want to think about the critical components of Orton Gillingham or Wilson Reading or whatever you might be using for that particular student. And that's what you would want to lay out in the student's as far as the student's SDI methodology, excuse me. And then lastly, the delivery of instruction. So we talked about who, where, and when it happens. So thinking about the amount of time, the sessions, who's going to deliver that student's SDI. And it doesn't have to be the special education teacher. However, we know in most cases, that's what happens. So these are going to be the elements of those students' SDI. And when we talk about or we think about adapting that student's SDI, these are the three elements that we want to think about first, right? When the student is not making progress, is it the content? Is it the methodology? Is it the how we're delivering it for that student? Or is it the delivery? You know, is it not enough sessions? Is it too many sessions? Is it too much time in those sessions? So considering all of these things when you're making adaptations to that student's SDI. Then we just wanted to provide you with more context in terms of the elements of the SDI. So for content, what does that look like? It can be all of these things. It can be their social behavior, because remember, it's not just about academics. It could also be about their functional skills, which may include their social behaviors, their social language skills, thinking about areas of reading where the student needs to be supported. Math, again, we talked about those functional skills, handwriting, spelling, etc. And then the methodology, the how. So again, thinking about not necessarily writing or adding to that student's IEP that you're going to use this specific program. Rather, you want to lay out what are the elements of that program that's going to allow me to deliver that instruction, that those practices, those approaches, that systematic approach that you're using in order to deliver the student's SDI. So again, guidance here, what does it look like? Are there timed activities? The use of scaffolding. So what approaches, what practices are you using in order to implement that student's SDI? And then lastly, delivery of instruction. We talked about the who. Again, not always being the special ed teacher. It could be a content specialist. Again, that looks different in different contexts. Intervention specialist, reading specialist, etc. And then the where. Where does this SDI happen for that student? Is it in the special education classroom, the general education classroom? And again, these are determinations by the team using data. And then the when. What does that look like? How many sessions? How much time? So making and determining all of those different clarification points in terms of the delivery of the instruction. I see just a couple of points here, specifically for Ohio. The guidance is that the SDI must be taught by the intervention specialist or the related service personnel. And then one thing we always mention is that we speak from a federal standpoint. This is what IDEA says, which is, your baseline or at minimum what you do, but there is additional guidance in what the state says, which most times goes above and beyond of what IDEA says, which is great. But again, in different contexts, different states, there are different guidance on who will implement the student's SDI. Additional point here, IDEA says being delivered by trained staff. Again, considering the knowledge, the skills that that individual may have, and that's the individual who would implement the SDI. Sarah, did you want to add something?
I did. There was a question. I think it's just gone further up into the chat, so you probably didn't have a chance to scroll back into looking at it, but I think it's a really important one that we get a lot, and you can take it, I can take it, either one of us, but they're having some conversation, and then I saw it start to come into the conversation around the Ohio, but it's around when we're talking about servicing a student's SDI with first of all, there were several questions around a interventionist, if they chose to be the person that has the best skill set to provide the SDI for the student. How does that impact the non-disabled peers that may be a part of the same group or activity? And they also were curious if that was allowed, and you were touching on it. Some states may have further regulations than what we will speak of at a federal level, but from a federal standpoint, can you clarify that, or I can, if you would like me to as well?
So clarify what IDEA says versus maybe what a state may require.
Just around a student with a disability participating in a group with non-disabled peers, and is that allowed? Can that still be counted as SDI? When does that impact the student's ability to get their SDI? Those types of questions.
So maybe I'll let you first answer that question, and then I'll elaborate as needed.
Perfect. So we get this question a lot, and Tessie responds to it a lot in emails, and it's something that comes into our center all the time. So I'm really thankful that you guys brought this up, and I think it's a point that we should clarify. And the reality, the way IDEA is set up is that there's funding, and then there's regulations. And when you're talking about a student with a disability, if the student is being provided SDI, and there are non-disabled peers that can benefit from the same instruction, and it's not impacting the educator's ability to provide the SDI, that is appropriate for the student to be a part of that group, and students that are non-disabled to be a part of that group. Where the issue lies is when students that are not disabled or not identified, even with high levels of need that are not identified, if they are growing at a different rate, or they're needing different types of instruction, and it's impeding the ability to provide the SDI for the student that has been identified, that is where you can no longer have those students in the group. So it gets very difficult at times if students are growing at different rates. Sometimes it works really well. So people ask, can a student with a disability, so that might be an example of a special education teacher teaching a specific program that works for the student's SDI, and they bring in a couple of students that are not identified into that group. And again, what I just answered with is what you need to think about. The other question we get is, can we push a student with a disability into maybe an intervention group provided by an interventionist. And it's the same answer. If that student with SDI, if the team has identified that interventionist as the most qualified person to implement that student's SDI, for example, the interventionist is trained in Orton Gillingham. And I know that question came up several even in the Q&A. And they are the only ones on school that have it. And the district says, instead of training the special ed teacher, we don't really have the funding. We already have a trained staff. That student's going to go work with that staff member. Again, there can be non-disabled peers within that group, but they have to ensure that that SDI is met for that student and that that student's growth is not impacted by the growth of other students, maybe not making as much progress as that student, or vice versa. The student with a disability isn't able to grow as quickly as the other students and they need more intensive supports. That being said, that's kind of the federal lens. Now, when you're talking about Ohio, there may be different regulations and they may go further. Some places, when they talk about funding and the state gives the federal funding out to the school districts, they require certain teacher certifications to be able to work with certain students. I saw that there was an intervention certification. That's not standard practice in all states. And so each individual state may go above what the federal guidance is. And so it's critical that you look into that at your state level, because as a federal sender, we don't look at the individual states. We can help you if you reach out to us, if you can't find the information, but we can't give guidance on it, or we can't help train on that, because as you know, there's a lot of different states and everybody interprets IDA just a little bit different in how they expect it to be implemented.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. And that was the reason why I wanted you to take that question, because I've heard you explain it in that way before. And everyone also agrees that your explanation was wonderful. So they're, having conversations about this. But I do want to pose another question to you, because I know that this has come up pretty often too, in terms of like the use of high leverage practices and universal design for learning. Like, what is the extent of, how that might be included in a student's STI, or, like, what is the approach for that?
Great. Those are great questions. This is exactly what we wanted to get to with this session today. And this is where the mystery of SDI comes from, is that we have really good high leverage teaching practices. We have really good universal design for learning. We have all these great approaches that we can use with students. But the reality is all of those are for all students. So UDL should be used in your general education setting. Universal design, by its name and its right, it's universal, meaning it should be available for all learners. Where the difference is when we take what they're doing in that universal design for learning and we think about what aids and services a child needs based on their disability. That's the critical piece, because every student in a classroom has needs. Every kid needs something a little bit different. But when we're talking about our students with SDI, we're talking about that UDL. We're saying what instructional practices do they need? What services do they need in order to access that universal design for learning structure that teacher is implementing, that are required because of the impact of their disability? That's the difference. And many people are like, well, we're using UDL, we're using MTSS, we're using any of the approaches that schools are using right now, backwards mapping, all of those types of things. Those are for all students. We still have to consider the unique needs of our learners that with the identified disability, because it's impacting them based on that disability and how that allows them to access the general education curriculum, which, if you remember back to my section in the overall statement of services and aids and the 4 parts coming together, they need to be able to make progress in the general education curriculum. And some people say, what about our severe and profound students that have significant needs? How do we help them make progress in the general education curriculum? They are still required to make progress in the general education curriculum. It may look different. The modifications may be very vast. They may be very great, but that doesn't mean that they're still not learning what some of the standards are in that general education setting for all other students within the school setting. We have to be thinking about tying it back and giving them access where they are able to participate and access that environment. in their learning. And so, yes, this does include our severe and profound students. And we do get a lot of requests for more information on our severe and profound. And we have been working on that and thinking about that with the TIE Center as well.
Thanks, Sarah. So again, please continue to add your questions and thoughts in the chat. But on the next slide here, this is where we're having the conversation about the relationship between STI and database individualization, or DBI. And so our friends, we're gonna go to the next slide here. So not sure if many of you who are here are familiar with the National Center on Intensive Instruction, or NCII, but we did share a link to that webinar that goes more in depth on how do we ensure that the STI for that student is appropriate. And so what we did is we taken the DBI, which you may have seen this if you've been involved in like conversations and trainings on MTSS. So using this same iterative process to determine, again, if that STI is appropriate for the student. So what you see on the slide here on that right-hand side, again, this is a graphic from NCII, and it's the iterative process of DBI. So what you see at the top, thinking about that as the student's STI, the content, the methodology, and the service of delivery. So thinking about that at the top there. So what you do is of course, you're progress monitoring that student's, how that student is doing in terms of their STI. And what you see is you see that plus sign, or you see that minus sign. So if that student is not making progress, or if the student is making progress, let's start there first. If they are making progress, of course, you just continue to progress monitor that student. However many times you laid out in that student's monitoring plan. However, if the student is not responsive to the SEI, that's where you need to collect more data. You need to determine why is that student making progress. So that's that step of that diagnostic data, making a determination of, what about the student's SEI? Maybe it could be the implementation. So you want to think about fidelity of implementation. Is the student absent? If for whatever reason, scheduling purposes, the student is not coming to all of their sessions, or all of the sessions are not happening, whatever approaches that you might be using for that particular student. So again, going back to that content, that methodology, and that service delivery, thinking about all of those things, and then making your adaptations. So once you determine your hypothesis, you also want to design an adaptation to address your hypothesis. And again, you're still progress monitoring to determine, are the adaptations that I'm making in order for that student to continuously make progress towards their IEP goals, again, determining, okay, is that student, again, responsive or non-responsive? And you just go back through that cycle of making another hypothesis before moving forward. Again, Sarah put in the chat the webinar that really talks more about SDI and DBI, that process. But we're not going to spend a whole lot of time here today. But again, if you want to learn more, hear more, it's a really great webinar. I think I've heard it probably 3 or 4 times. But if you really want to go in depth, because it is what we're seeing as like a hot topic right now in terms of SDI and DBI. So on the next slide here, we're just going to take a moment and look at this chart here. So thinking about the process of DBI and SDI. On the next slide, Sarah. So here, what you see is this is just a hypothetical student. On this graph here on the left-hand side, this is where the student started. So thinking about the intervention as that student's SDI. You see different points of where we're making adaptations. So we're just going to give you like a minute or two to just kind of review this graph. Think about what you see, and then share out what would you do next in terms of this student. Would you further make adaptations? Would you just continue with what you're doing and progress monitor? What are your thoughts? So we'll just give you about a minute or so to formulate thoughts and share them in the chat. All right, so I'm going to bring you back. I'm starting to see some initial thoughts about what you see. And so I'm seeing that, of course, this is, based on the need for, this is the need for more in-depth diagnostication or data to determine what the next steps would be. And you're absolutely correct, but also the need for more information to know, why in particular that student may not be making progress. So as you can see, based on the trend line, you know, it's not really trending in the way that you would say, okay, yeah, that student will make sufficient progress and meet their goal by the end of the school year. So again, continuously making those adaptations. And I think that's, the point that we're trying to get at here is that, yes, the student is making progress, but is it sufficient enough in order for them to meet their goal at the end of the year? So also keeping in mind that, the DBI for HDI is an iterative process and it's continuous. Continuously monitoring that students' progress or progress monitoring to ensure that students are continuously making sufficient progress in order to meet their goal. But again, the webinar, very interactive, gives you more in-depth information on learning this iterative process and how you can incorporate that into your current context. Other things from the chat. I see adaptation 2 increase their learning more efficiently than adaptation 1. Are there other adaptations that can be implemented to implement the goal? These are all great questions. Again, as you start, if you dive deep, unless you're someone who's already doing this, but keeping this in mind that it's a continuous iterative process. If you see that adaptation 1, for whatever reason, the students started to make more progress than adaptation 2, now we need to go back and consider, what about adaptation 1 and 2 is different? Is there something about, again, the implementation that may have interfered with that student making more progress after implementing that second adaptation? I see questions about what is working for them, what is not working. So again, sometimes also comparing those adaptations you may make to that student's SDI. What else? I see a comment, the child is making progress, but they're not on track to meet their goal. I would take the time to determine if there are other interventions that may support the child. So again, going back to those elements of that student's SDI, is it the content? Is it the methodology, or is it the delivery? So thinking about all of these things in terms of their adaptation and making another database decision. I see another comment here, performing further assessments, investigating the implementation of the adaptations. Yes, these are all great thoughts on what you would do next. So again, just knowing it's an iterative process, it could look different on how you approach it, but the importance is that you are always, going back and considering, based on the data that you're collecting, what do I need to do next in order to continue to ensure that that student is meeting their IEP goals. So what we're going to do now, because we have been here for quite some time, it's 2:35 Eastern. We're going to give you 15 minutes to take a break, maybe grab a snack, a beverage, and we'll reconvene in about 15 minutes.
Okay, we're gonna get back to our session. And we have been working, I will say, very well with our ASL interpreters. We are sorry about the lagging. We are doing our best to rectify that. Technology is technology. And no fault of theirs, they are doing their absolute best to help us. So please be patient with us with that, and hopefully it'll get better as we progress. So we're going to keep moving into the next portion of our training. This last one, we're going to cover the 3 additional parts to the Statement of Services and Aids. Again, we're demystifying SDI, but we really need to understand all 4 parts. So we're going to spend a little bit less time on each one of these tip sheets, but you will find them in the chat. You will also, if you look back right after the dotted line when we went to break, I went ahead and shared the IEP tip sheet facilitator guide that we mentioned earlier. That is how to use the tip sheets. It's a similar type of activity. It can be used with any of our tip sheets. We have tip sheets for families. We have tip sheets on each element of the IEP. And we also have all of these tip sheets as well. And we encourage you to use them. The facilitator guide is a general guide to help you use any of the tip sheets based on any of the content on them that you would like to share with an audience, to make it less about handing them a paper and saying, here, read this, to how do I help them learn and grow their skills from what we're doing. And that's the idea behind the activity. If any of you are joining the coaching session tomorrow that I will be presenting with a panel of our local partners, we will be talking about how we use the tip sheet activity and the facilitator guide to help within a coaching institute to develop skills of local coaches to coach special education staff in the process. So join tomorrow if you want to hear a little bit more about that activity as well. So without further ado, we're going to drop in the next tip sheet, which is the related service tip sheet. I'm actually going to only give you 2 minutes this time. It does say 3 minutes on the screen, but I'm going to give you 2 minutes to read through it. I think you guys have this activity down. I want you to focus on what does IDEA say, and then think about what is the primary purpose of related services. That's the key one. I want to see if you guys can really pick up on what is the primary purpose of related services, and who generally provides the service, and who can provide this related service. And then many of you had questions about the types of services, that we have a bunch listed there. So look through those quickly. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and set the timer. You may begin. If you're not done reading, please continue to read. As you are finishing up, what is the primary purpose that you're seeing for related services? Okay, I see a couple people saying to assist the child with a disability to support their special education services, or SDI. That is the key. It is to access and benefit from their SDI. So related services in general are put there in order for the student to access and benefit from the special education services. Special education services, if you remember what Tamara just went over with you, are to access and benefit from the general education setting. So some students need only special ed services, and they don't need any related services to help them access and benefit from their special ed services. But we have some kids who need related services in order to access and benefit from their special education services. So a great example that we like to talk about when we think about this is a piece of assistive technology. In the beginning, when a child's introduced to a piece of assistive technology, whether it be a low tech or high tech, there is instruction and learning that has to take place with the use of that piece of technology. There's also potentially vocabulary and understanding of the wording and those types of things that are used with that assistive technology. And then they also need to know how to use, students need to know how to use that assistive technology to support their special education. So within that, where the services are taking place for their special education. And then at some point, the student will know how to use that low tech or high tech assistive technology, and they're no longer in need of the related service. There's no longer instruction needed around that assistive technology. They know how to operate it. They know the vocabulary, they know the wording, they know the layout, and they are independent with that. It no longer is a need for a related service. It then changes over to a supplementary aid-in service that allows them to access and benefit from their special ed and general education setting or instruction, excuse me. And when Tamara starts talking about supplementary aids and services in a few minutes, we'll talk a little bit more about that. But a related service is something that allows a student to access their special education service, and that's critical. Many people in places have related service providers who write IEP goals. So how many of you today still see speech language, OT, PT, whoever it is that's providing a related service to your child, write individual present levels and IEP goals? So in the chat, you can, actually, you don't have to put it in the chat. Maybe you don't want to, and that's okay. But in your mind, think about if you have people that are doing that. Okay, so I definitely see people doing that. What I will tell you with that is that if it's in support of the special education services, that there should not be standalone related service goals. They are supporting the special education services. So if a student has some sort of dysgraphia and they have a writing issue, they need goals around writing, but part of that support is also OT services in order for them to have better fine motor skills to be able to complete the writing goals. That occupational therapist who is providing those related services is going to support the writing goals, and they're going to collaborate with a special education teacher in order to do that. So I'm going to say that again, that there really is no need for, really there shouldn't be standalone related service goals because they are supporting the special education services. Now I know that's very different than a lot of places have heard, and a lot of places currently do that. I see some hums, I see some, okay, I didn't know that, or unsure. But the reality is when we're thinking about the statement of services, and we're talking about annual goals, and again, we're not covering the annual goal part of the IEP today, but we're talking about the annual goal has to be progress throughout the whole year. And multiple people can service one goal in order for the student to make progress. And that is why we don't see the standalone need for standalone goals. And because often, if you look at related service goals and you look at special education goals, they're very similar. The OT, using my example of writing, the OT is talking about using correct pencil grip, pressure, that type of thing. But that also needs to happen with the special education services, because if they're not utilizing that during those services, then they're not accessing and benefiting from that service. And so we get this question all the time. We give that answer all the time, and many people are like, oh my gosh, I didn't think of it that way. And we have a graphic that we'll be showing here in just a couple of minutes that will show you why that is the explanation and how it is best practice for that moving forward. So I'll show that to you a little bit further. Who generally delivers related services and who can provide those services? What did you guys find in the tip sheet about who generally does this? I'm just looking back to see if anybody put any answers to that. Okay, I didn't see any back there. Okay, so we say it is the most qualified professionals. We see that it is somebody. Now, some states have requirements that say in order to provide a related service, you must be a licensed therapist. Some states do not have that. Again, we're federal. And so when we look at it from the federal lens and we look at this tip sheet, we are saying that the related service can be provided by the person that feels the most qualified. for the service. If you're talking about an assistive technology, you could have a paraprofessional that may be doing some of that related service in support from other professionals. You could have a reading specialist providing some of that. You could have an orientation and mobility specialist providing that. So it depends somewhat on your state regulations, and I will tell you some states have more strict guidance on that, and others are more only using the federal guidance, where it's open to whichever licensed professionals they feel are appropriate. But some states, I will tell you, and it's important that you know that, some states do require certain licensures to provide certain services. And so just be aware that that could be different in your state, and that could be different than the federal guidance. But in general, it is the main, it is just who we feel is most qualified to provide the student that service. So what questions do you have about related services? I saw many of you way back in the beginning when we were talking about the overview of the statement of services and aids, and you put in there about parent counseling and how that you were a little bit surprised that that was a related service and that that could be provided. Now, thinking about what I just said, when we said that a related service is in order to support special education services, when we think about parent counseling, now sometimes the word counseling can throw people off and they think about like a therapy session. But parent counseling is a little bit, it's the way IDEA is written, it's a little bit more broad around the idea of parent counseling. Counseling is more, do they need instruction? So if I'm going back to my assistive technology example, and I'm saying the student needs to learn how to use the device, when we provide assistive technology, as many of you know, we have to ensure that that assistive technology is available to the child at all times throughout their day. So we can't just have them using it at school. We also need them to be working on those skills at home. And so we may have to provide some parent counseling on how to use the technology with the student in the home setting. And again, that could be low tech or high tech. It doesn't have to be a computerized system that we often think of. It could be picture card exchange systems. It could be any of that. But if we're using that at school, if that is their communication system and it's required and for them to access their special ed services, then they need to know how to use it at home, because that getting to school is part of accessing their special education services. And so that is where parent counseling can come in. Sometimes we think of it when we have a child with a behavior plan, and we need to provide the parent some support in how to utilize the same skills and strategies that we're using with the student in order to implement them at home, because it helps the student to access their special education services. Thinking about that, if you have more questions, I want you to keep putting them into the chat. Tamara and I are going to continue to answer those. But I'm just going to flip to this screen, because this is the IDA language specifically. And again, we just highlighted the benefit from, they must benefit from the related service to support the special education services. And I saw somebody put in transportation services. When a child is in need of transportation services, it is being able to access their special education services. So that's often when we put in a specialized bus that may need to allow the student to get to and from the school to be able to access their special ed service. If you go in and actually read special ed services, besides specially designed instruction, there's also travel training as a part of that. And that travel training is part of what we are thinking about, and it's different than transportation services. And I just want to highlight that. Travel training is teaching students. So again, this is teaching them something. Teaching students how to use a bus, how to use public transportation. This could be orientation and mobility services. This could be anything that's teaching them how to travel in their environment in order to access and benefit from the general education curriculum. That is a special ed service. That is different than transportation services, which is our ability to give students access to the setting, school setting, to get their special education services. So I want to make the point that there is two types. Travel services falls under special education and is a specially designed instruction for a student, where transportation services is a related service. And
Yeah, I would say there were a couple of questions. One specifically, I think it kind of goes back to a point you were just making about developing goals. So if a child needed counseling related services, would that child need to have a specific goal?
sorry, Tamara, can you say that one more time?
So the question or the discussion, it was if a child requires counseling as a related service, will they need a specific goal? And I think that kind of goes back to the point that you were making, is that there may be cases where the related service provider is going to be supporting another goal. It could be a functional skill for that particular student. So I think they kind of like started to answer their own question, but
Right.
I don't know if you wanted to elaborate or maybe repeat it again.
Yeah. No, that's a great example. That's another example for us to kind of wrap our minds around that idea, is that if a child has a behavioral need and they require counseling services through the school in order to make progress on IEP goals, that indicates that they're needing to be able to access their special education services. And that becomes a related service, which means it's supporting a special education goal. So depending on the state you're in, it could be a functional skill that you're supporting. That can fall under social, emotional, behavioral goals. Every state can call it a little bit different in how they identify those types of, it could be communication goal. It could be any of those types of goals that the student needs, that you then, the counselor or whoever's providing that counseling service, then is looking at it around maybe self-regulation or communication or anger management, because we know that if they were working on that service alone, or that one isolated time, an hour a week maybe, or 30 minutes a week that they're getting counseling, if that's the only time they worked on that, we know we would likely not see progress. And we need that to be something that they're working on across multiple services. And so related services supports the special education services, and then the special education services support the general education services that are happening. And so again, you guys were answering your own question after our discussion, but it is that idea that related services support the special education services. And so there should be goals for the special education services that a related service provider needs. Now, many people ask, well, when we have parents that are saying, well, I want my student to have speech services, or I want my student to have these other types of services, I think it's important for the IEP team to be thinking about what goals do we have based on the data and the information in the present level, because that is telling us what the student is in need of. And do we have goals that a related service provider can support in that process? And there are times when a child needs a specific service in order to access and benefit from the general education curriculum. So this is a little bit of a different caveat. If a student needs it as a special education service in order to access the general education, it's documented as SDI and not a related service. So some people ask, well, what about standalone services, which is what my slide is saying here. In some cases, a speech language pathologist service or any other related service can actually be a special ed service and not a related service. They're not supporting something in special ed, they're supporting the general education setting. And that's the difference. So you could have a student that has a standalone IEP for speech language services because it's supporting their ability to access the general education, but it goes under special ed services. Maybe you have a student who is doing orientation and mobility services for a visual impairment or blindness, and they need that in order to access the school setting. If that's the case, it's special education and not a related service. And so that's the nuance that you have to think about when you're thinking, is it just because it's a related service provider giving the service doesn't necessarily mean it's a related service documented in the IEP, because it's all about, is that service supporting the special education services, or is it supporting the general education? If it's general ed, it would go under special education services. If that service is supporting special education, then it goes under related service. So that is a critical thing that I hope you can take away from today when you think about how do we clarify this and demystify what SDI really is for a student. So I see, so special education services support students to access and grow in the general education curriculum, and related services are for students to access and grow through their special education services, not goals, but services. Yes, that is exactly correct. So it says, so if an SLP service is used as a special education service, then the SLP would write the goal and the objective. Yes, they could do that at that point if they are the one providing that SDI. And of course, we'd want them collaborating if necessary with other providers as well. Good. You guys are getting this. It's not easy. It's also, I will tell you what we find in this training as we do it, and we do it several different ways, is that many people need to hear this more than one time. We work with a partnership site of ours, and we have done similar trainings to this 3 to 4 times before people have been able to really change practice. So you hear it one time and you're like, wait, what did they say? You hear it a second time and you're like, okay, I did hear that right the first time. This third time, usually you're like, I'm starting to like get it, and I'm going to change some practices. And maybe that takes 4 or 5 times before you feel comfortable making that change. But it's really, really important that you know that if you're feeling like, I'm not really sure about this, and man, these clarifications are questioning what my practices are, I encourage you to participate in some or watch some of our other webinars that we have up around the same topic. It may not be exactly the same, but it really gives you an opportunity to really think through this. It takes a few minutes to adjust how you've been practicing and what you're going to do moving forward. So this is just an example that we have of a physical impairment for a student who needs SDI delivered in by a physical therapist or adaptive PE teacher to access and benefit from the general education curriculum. So besides speech, here's another example. So we're just trying to give you lots and lots of examples on how this is set up with related services. So I'm going to pass it back over to Tamara.
Thanks, Sarah. So this is our final tip sheet that we're going to review. And similar to what Sarah did, we're just going to give you a little less time to review the tip sheet. So we're going to have Katie put this final tip sheet in the chat for you all to review. Again, I'll give you just a minute to review, and then we'll come back and start sharing our final thoughts on this last tip sheet. Right, so I am going to bring you back. So in the chat, let's start sharing our thoughts. So this tip sheet is focused on supplementary aids and services. So what is the primary purposes of aids and services? Feel free to also share your thoughts on whose role it is to provide these services. So thinking about where would a student be provided with these supplementary aids and services, and then also sharing what other questions you may have. Okay, so focus on access. I see general ed, students being educated in the general education classroom, enabling students to work in the environment with their grade level peers. So again, talking about the general education classroom, providing them access to accommodations or modifications they may need for students with disabilities to be educated to the maximum extent possible with their non-disabled peers. Again, I see the theme here, general education curriculum, accommodations, modifications. So you all are right on target with what IDA says about supplementary aids and services. So I'm going to move us to the next slide. So here, again, you see what is highlighted. Supplementary aids and services are provided in the regular or general education curriculum. So again, this is specifically what you all were talking about in terms of what supplementary aids and services are, and where these students are, how it's supporting students in the general education curriculum. So I'm going to move us to the next slide. So supplementary aids and services, this is where we talk about the accommodations and the modifications. And again, we're here to demystify, right? So even those of us who have been in education for decades, we see the common misconception between accommodations and modifications and having to explain the difference between the two. So this is what we do here, really laying out the difference between those instructional accommodations and those instructional modifications. So with your accommodations, they change how a student is accessing or demonstrating their learning. So we're not going to change what they're learning, we're changing how they're accessing or how they're demonstrating their learning. So examples of that, very commonly we see extended time to complete a task, maybe providing them with a reader for math assignments, calculators, and then on the other end, you have your modifications. So that's changing what students are learning and what may be required in order for them to demonstrate their learning. So examples of that may be changing their expectations for learning. And I guess maybe I just want to also reiterate here, thinking about still having high expectations for students. You know, although we may be changing the expectations of students to meet their unique needs, we also still want to make sure those expectations are high. It's not to say, you know, we have to keep it so low so they're like they're just meeting like the bare minimum. We still want their work to be rigorous. So although you're modifying and changing the expectations, always keeping those high expectations in mind for your students. It also may include reducing the requirements of the task, providing students with a reader for a reading comprehension task, or a calculator for math calculation activities. So we hope that this is helpful for you. Again, you'll have these slides available. So to bring back to your context and really sharing the difference between accommodations and modifications. And I'm going to move us to the next slide. And then just a question here. Did you know this, that students that only need accommodations to access and benefit from the general ed curriculum are not always eligible for an IEP under IDEA. So we know those students who may need accommodations may qualify for a section or 504 plan under section 504. But again, also keeping in mind that just because they don't qualify for special education does not mean they automatically qualify for a 504 plan to receive those accommodations. So we never want to promise that, not saying that we do, but also keeping that in mind, that students who may need accommodations, you know, they may qualify for a 504, but not promising that. So I'm going to see if there's any big questions that came from that.
There's a good question in there, the last question that I think is a great one if you want to clarify.
A question, comment about modifications. Curriculum is a means to achieve standards. If the standard is not altered, why is it a modification if an activity is altered? I hear the concern about lowering expectations, but sometimes reducing workload, such as fewer problems, can accommodate a need in a way that creates access to higher expectations in regard to the standard being worked on. So from my understanding of the question, for this particular student, if the standard is not altered, why is it a modification if the activity is not altered? So I think maybe, are you asking, maybe I'm not understanding because I'm also reading it live, but Sarah, help me.
Yeah, I think I'm hearing it, and please, if you're not, please clarify in the, if we're not answering it correctly, please clarify. But what I think I'm hearing is you're saying if I'm using an alternative curriculum to achieve the same standards that the other students are achieving, is it a modification? And this is where it's individualized. And that if you look back at, if I move back one slide, Tamara's slides back, Some of these examples could be just an accommodation for one student. Some of them could be a modification for another. And so it's really hard for us to sometimes put examples up because somebody might come in and say, well, extended time it could be for a student, that could be a modification. I'm actually giving them 3 times as much time, depending on what we're asking. And so it could be a modification depending on the individual unique needs of the student. I think that's what's the most critical piece here is you have to think, are you changing how, which is the how the student is going to demonstrate their learning of what they've learned, but you're not, or are you changing what you want them to learn? And that's when you make the differentiation about, is it an accommodation or a modification? We could throw out 100 examples, but for an individual student with a disability, we don't know them. You know them as an IEP team, and you're going to decide, is this a modification or an accommodation? And one student, it might be an accommodation. Another student, it could be a modification. But if you are modifying a complete curriculum, which does change standards, yes, that would be a modification, but that would actually go under program modifications, which we're going to switch to in just a second and talk through a little bit. So if we didn't quite answer that correctly, please put it in the chat and we'll try to respond, but we need to keep moving so we have time to do our fun activity at the end.
Yeah. And I'm just gonna answer one last question because we do get this question pretty often about if there's ever a student that has an IEP and a 504, and that is possible. Again, it is situational, but this is just like the best example that I can provide. Again, this is not guidance to tell you that this is how it happens, but this is just a situation. It could be a student who has, currently has an IEP for, I don't know, just throwing it out there, a specific learning disability. Say that particular student broke their arm and they need accommodations for testing, whatever the case may be, because they broke their arm. Maybe they broke their right arm, which is their writing arm, and they need a 504 temporarily to support their accommodations. So that is just like one instance, but again, it's situational.
And you have to remember that an IEP falls, like it's a more restrictive group of qualifications in order to do that. So more students with disabilities will qualify under 504. Well, if you qualify under 504 and you qualify as an IDEA student, then your accommodations and modifications are your 504. So if you had a student who was a learning disabled student and they also had diabetes, and they needed some accommodations related to their diabetes in the school setting, it would be added to the IEP. Likely school districts have healthcare plans and people could reference the healthcare plan. I mean, however it's set up in your district is unique to you. But yes, the accommodations and modifications in an IEP also fall under the umbrella of 504. It's a much bigger umbrella and less rigorous in order to be identified under. IDEA has the 13 categories of disability. They have to meet one of those 13, and they have to need specially designed instruction in order to meet those 2 prongs. But they need to be able to access the general education curriculum. And sometimes they need those accommodations for other conditions that fall under a 504, but not under IDEA. They would still be implemented. And every district documents that. Again, this is documentation versus implementation. Everybody documents it a little bit different than they do it. And you just need to know what the common practice in your state and your local district is and how to document that. So I'm going to keep us moving. We're not going to do this activity, but I just want to go over the last tip sheet. I am still going to have Katie put it into the chat for us today. But this is the program modifications and support for school personnel. And we want to make you aware, this is one of the most underutilized portions of the IEP. And I want to give you guys an opportunity on your own time to read over this a little more thoroughly. But the idea behind this is the program modification has to support progress towards their annual goals. So if you're modifying a complete curriculum for a student, so you have decided that the standards that all students are learning at their current grade level is not appropriate for your student, and you're making a modification to their entire curriculum, that is a program modification. If you're shortening a student's day, that's an example of a program modification that may need to be documented in the IEP. The part that's the most underutilized, I think a lot of people know about that part, but it's the support for school personnel. And we talked about it at the very beginning, which is why we're going to spend a little less time on it right now, is that it is the training that any staff member that is going to implement the IEP needs in order to be able to implement it successfully. It could be training on a behavior plan. It could be training on a specific program. It could be the lunch ladies that you have in your school need some support in how to interact with that student. Those should be documented and utilized in the IEP as part of a need for that student. And again, it's one of the more underutilized portions of the statement of services and aids. So when we think about everything that we've covered today, because we're getting closer to our end of our time, and we have a little game to test your knowledge and make it fun at the end and wake everybody up and make sure they're with us, I just want to review. We have developed this logic model graphic for you to really think about what we were just talking about. So you're going to see the related services, special education service, supplementary aids and services, and program modifications and support for school personnel. Those are the 4 areas we took a deep dive into today. And what you can see is that they help the students access and benefit from the general education curriculum. But what you can see is that program modifications and support for school personnel may be a direct service to the general education curriculum, or it may be a service to the special education curriculum or special education services, excuse me. The program or the supplementary aids and services is giving them access and benefit from the general education curriculum. But you'll notice that the related service is not a direct benefit to the general education curriculum because it is benefiting the special ed, and together the related service and special ed is then benefiting the general education curriculum. But ultimately, all 4 of these work together to benefit the general education curriculum, which gives us the post-secondary outcomes that we're looking for. And this has taken us 5 years to develop this logic model. It seems like such a simple graphic, but it really was hard for people to wrap their mind around how these services fit together and allow students to make progress in that bigger picture of getting students to post-secondary outcomes and graduation rates that we would like to see. Due to time, I'm going to go ahead and move past this little video, but we will share it out with you and you guys can watch that. It just kind of talks about the harmony between the statement of services and aids. Because we have, we have a fun little game to end this day with you guys. So I'd like you to get back into your Mentimeter, scan it. Katie's putting the Mentimeter up for you. And yes, we'll get you the video link. We'll put it in there. It is a quick little video for you to watch. And it's actually in our self-paced module under the statement of services and aids that is free to you, free to anybody if they want to take it. This little video is a portion of that online module, which is a great module for people to watch. So I hope everybody is in the Mentimeter, and the link is in the chat. We're going to start off. So what I'm going to do is read you a scenario, and you're going to tell me, based on your learning today, which one of the 4 areas of services is it, or is it other and it doesn't fall under one of them? Oh, Menti says you already answered questions. Let me, interesting. Let me see if we can restart it. It may be because I haven't
to the next question.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I haven't hit the next one yet. Okay, so I'm going to start this. A child with a learning disability is reading 2 grade levels below and is provided a peer reader to access grade level assignments. Which service is this, or is it other? I'm going to give you just about 15 to 20 seconds to answer it. Get your answers in. They're going up. Good job. Good job. Okay, looks like it's kind of slowed down. Most people have gotten their answers. The correct answer is supplementary aids and services. This is an aid that is being provided to a student to give them access to the general education grade level assignments. So that is the caveat. So if you didn't get that one correct, that's okay. That is the idea behind our game. Several people will say, these are trick questions. We did not design them to be trick questions. We know that that's not fair as a teacher, but what we tried to do is really get to the nuance of the wording in the questions to help us really clarify which service or aid is it. So let's go to the next one. General education and special education teacher meet monthly to develop programming, allowing students with disabilities access to the general education curriculum. What is this one? Okay, we're getting quite a few responses in there. All right, let's look at the answer. Slow down. It is program modifications and support for school personnel. And I see that modifications is spelled wrong, and we apologize for that. I'll make that correction on our next slide, or next time we present this. It is a program modification because it is a student with a disability. And if you're collaborating on one student, that becomes a program modification or support for school personnel. Time to collaborate is critical. You can write that in. Several people asked, how do I ensure that a general education teacher collects the data necessary to support the SDI if they're providing the SDI? This would be a critical piece that could be added into your support for school personnel, is that they have time allotted in their day to collaborate with each other based on that individual student's IEP. If it said a gen ed teacher and a special ed teacher were meeting to talk about all the special education students, that would be an other, because it's not specific to one student's needs. Okay, next slide. Students with a disability take a required 9th grade study skills class. What do you think that is? Students with a disability take a required 9th grade study skill class. Hey, we're seeing quite a few. And oh, and it already said the correct answer on it. I'm sorry, some of you picked up on that. Good job. But it is other. And the reason this one is other is that just because the student has a disability doesn't mean that there are not requirements for them. This is a required class for all students in 9th grade, and they have access just like all students. So there is nothing specialized based on their disability that would indicate through this statement that they it was another service area. Good one. So sorry. Oh, miss. So sorry. I skipped too many together. Okay. All right, next one. This one has that too. Hopefully you didn't see it. Students identified with a math calculation disability is able to use a calculator problem solving on a problem solving assignment. So several of you saw that. Good job. I'm glad you're using context clues. And you can see that that is a supplementary aid and service, that they are using that in order to access that assignment. And we would have to determine if that is an accommodation or a modification based on that individual student's needs. Good job. Next one. We're going to skip that one because the answer is showing. Okay. So a student is taught how to use manipulatives to address and organize deficits identified in the evaluation report. What is this one? Hey. Many of you see this. This is SDI. They are taught. That's the key word. SDI is about what we're teaching our students. It has to be something that they need to be taught in order to gain access to the general education curriculum and setting. So they're taught to use manipulatives to address the organizational deficit. And we know it is a disability because it's in an evaluation report. Good job. You guys got this down. Student uses, I don't know why all of mine are showing. Students uses a calculator to complete grade level assignments. Okay, so we have kind of a tie between supplementary aids and services and others. Okay. So the correct answer here is other. And the reason this one is other and not supplementary aids and services is it's a student. We don't know if it's a student with a disability. If the student with a if it said a student with a disability uses a calculator to complete grade level assignments, it would be a supplementary aid and service. But because it just says student uses, we don't know if they have a disability, so it would be other, because we have to make sure that it is. And that's where people are like, this is a trick question. No, we really want you to kind of really think about those nuances. And this is a great activity to use with staff when you're trying to help them really think about the 4 service areas and how they're identifying what students' needs, how they're gathering that information, and then going to document that within, and then how do they implement it. All right, so a student with a disability requires travel services to and from school. Oh, we already had some people start that one. That's okay. Go ahead and go with that. A student with a disability requires travel services to and from school. So we have some related services, supplementary aids and services. So our correct answer here, we're slowing down, is a related service. And it is a related service because, as we read on the tip sheet, it allows students to access their special education services. So they need to be able to get to school. Travel services is getting to and from school. Travel training is the SDI, where they need to actually be taught how to get to and from jobs or school. This one is just allowing the student to gain access to the school where the SDI will be provided. Good job, you guys are getting this. All right, I'm going to start this Menti. A child with a learning disability is reading 2 grade levels below, 2 grades below level, and is provided a peer tutor to access grade level assignments. Which one is this one? Okay, so we have some related service, we have some supplementary aid and service answers, program modifications. Okay, and this one is a supplementary aid and service. Yes, this allows, it talks about a student with a disability, and it is allowing them to access grade level materials. So you guys are getting this. So due to time, I'm going to go ahead and skip through the last couple of questions we have. And I'm going to ask, thank you all for participating and being so interactive with us today. I know that you have some questions in the chat and within our Q&A that we will try to get responses to. But you can be in touch with us at promotingprogress.org. I also put in there our email box is progresscenter@air.org, and I'll have Katie drop that in the chat as well. And you feel free to email us, ask us questions, clarification if we didn't get it answered for you today. This is where you can find the series of tip sheets that we use today. They are also linked in the overall conference site if you would like to access any of them in the future. There's self-paced modules, so that video that we didn't get to see today is in the self-paced module, as well as we will get that link up for you. Follow us on Facebook and on what used to be Twitter and X. We appreciate all of your time, energy, investment into students with disabilities. Please let us know how we can support you in the work that you're doing as we continue to help support the greater field. Thank you for your time today, and we appreciate your interaction. Thank you to our ASL interpreters and our CART interpreter that have helped us make this accessible for all. Have a good afternoon.